The morning Michaela Hartley crossed the threshold of Ashvale, the frost had already whitened the stone steps, and a thin skin of ice lay over the ornamental pond to the east of the drive. She carried one trunk, a leather satchel worn soft at the clasp, and 40 pounds promised to her at year's end if she proved suitable. The word suitable hung in the air of the entrance hall before anyone spoke it aloud. And it was spoken very quickly. Lady Dorothea Ashford descended the staircase with the measured certainty of a woman who had never needed to hurry because the room had always arranged itself to wait for her. She wore a gown of dark gray satin, her silver hair dressed in the fashion of a decade past, her fan held at a precise angle that communicated assessment without interest. She looked at Michaela once, from the hem of her plain brown traveling dress to the careful knot of her chestnut hair, and her expression did not shift. It simply settled. "Miss Hartley?" she said. I had expected someone a little more established. Michaela kept her hands folded over her satchel and met the older woman's gaze without flinching. "I am 24 years old, my lady. I come with letters from 3 households, including the Countess of Brentford, who was kind enough to note my work with her daughters in some detail." "The Countess of Brentford," Lady Dorothea repeated, as though naming a province she had decided not to visit. "Yes, well, you will find Ashvale requires more than the Brentford girls needed." She turned, speaking over her shoulder to the housekeeper, Mrs. Peel. "See that she is installed in the East Wing room, the small one." Mrs. Peel, a compact woman of 60 with a face that had long ago settled into watchful neutrality, caught Michaela's eye for just a moment. Not pity, exactly. Recognition. Michaela followed her up 3 flights of stairs, through corridors growing steadily colder and narrower, to a room with one window that looked out onto the kitchen garden, a single candle on the writing table, and a fireplace the width of 2 hands. She set her trunk down. She unpacked her books first, as she always did, arranging them along the windowsill in the order she intended to use them. Spines outward. Homer. Arithmetic. A battered copy of Johnson's Dictionary. A volume of natural history she had carried since her father died. She was a clergyman's daughter, which meant she was educated past her station and positioned below it. Her father had died in the spring of 1813, leaving behind a library, a great deal of affection from his parishioners, and debts totaling 112 pounds that Michaela had spent the better part of a year quietly discharging. The 40 pounds from Ashvale would close what remained. After that, she did not permit herself to think too far ahead. Thinking too far ahead was a luxury for women with options. She had arrived on the 16th of October, 1814, 60 miles from London. And what she understood about Ashvale in the first 3 days, she learned not from the Dowager, but from Clara. Clara Ashford was 11 years old and had not spoken more than 6 consecutive words to any adult in the house since her mother died 18 months prior. She sat at the schoolroom table with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on some middle distance that no lesson had yet managed to interrupt. She was not defiant. She was simply absent, present in body and withdrawn everywhere else, a child who had learned that the surest way to survive loss was to make oneself small enough that nothing further could find her. Michaela recognized that particular geometry of grief. She did not push. The first week she read aloud, sitting at her own side of the table, working through the natural history volume she had carried from home, describing the migration patterns of starlings and the architecture of honeybee combs as though she were simply reading for her own pleasure, and Clara were free to listen or not. On the 4th day, Clara turned her head slightly. On the 6th, she asked, in a voice nearly inaudible, whether starlings could remember where they had been. "I believe they navigate by the stars," Michaela said, not looking up, keeping her voice as even as if the question were entirely ordinary. and by the pull of the earth, so in a way they always know where they have been. It is written into them." Clara did not reply. She looked back at her folded hands. But something in the set of her shoulders had shifted, the smallest degree, and Michaela noted it and let it be. The second week brought Latin and arithmetic, and on the Wednesday came the incident that changed the shape of everything. Mr. Colby, the drawing master, had been engaged to examine Clara's progress with a pencil. He was a thin man of 40, with neat hands, and a habit of making assessments sound like eulogies. He examined Clara's sketch of a garden urn, tilted it once, and said, in a voice that carried easily across the schoolroom, "Given her mother's natural facility with the arts, it is a pity the daughter has inherited so little of it." The room did not go quiet. It had already been quiet. But Michaela felt the silence change its quality, felt Clara's stillness become a different kind of stillness, the kind that flinches inward rather than outward. She set down her pen. "Mr. Colby," she said, in the same measured tone she had used for the starlings, "Miss Clara has been working from observation for 3 weeks and has made considerable progress. If you would like to note her improvement since the first sketch, which I can show you, that would be a useful comparison. Comparisons to the dead are not useful to the living." Mr. Colby's neat hands went still. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He set the sketch down with precision and made a remark about the quality of the pencils, which suggested he intended to forget the exchange had taken place. Clara did not look at Michaela. She picked up her pencil and resumed her sketch, drawing a careful line along the urn's left curve with a hand that no longer trembled. What Michaela did not know, and would not know for some days, was that the Duke of Ashval had passed the schoolroom door at the moment she spoke, on his way to a meeting with his land steward about the eastern boundary wall, and that he had stopped. She did not know because she had not looked toward the door, and she had no way of reading the quality of the silence in the corridor beyond it. She understood only that Clara's hand steadied, and that afterward the child began to ask questions during lessons, small, careful questions, as though testing whether the ground would hold. Julian Ashford, Duke of Ashvale, had the kind of face that landscapes produce in men who have spent years outdoors, in weather that had no interest in their feelings about it. His jaw was a precise angle, his eyes a gray that shifted toward green in cold light, and his manner in any room containing people was one of studied insufficiency, as though he considered the expenditure of warmth on social occasion a poor investment. He was 34 years old, had been a widower for 18 months, and had arranged his life at Ashvale around the proposition that competent management of the estate was a sufficient contribution to the world, and that nothing further should be required of him. He summoned Michaela to his study on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks into her employment. The study occupied the south corner of the house, lined with ledgers and maps, a globe set near the window, at an angle that suggested it was consulted rather than displayed. He was standing when she entered, his back to the door, looking out at the park, where the last of the autumn oaks were releasing their leaves in a slow copper fall. "Miss Hartley," he said, turning. He did not gesture toward a chair. "Your Grace," she said. "Mrs. Peel tells me Clara asked to continue her lessons on the day she was given leave, that she requested to remain in the schoolroom voluntarily. She did. That has not happened before. I am glad to hear it." He looked at her for a moment with an attention that was not quite what she had expected, not the appraising inventory of the dowager, but something more considered, as though he were reading a passage he had come across before and wished to place its source. She held still under it, her hands at her sides, her expression composed. "I should like a written account of Clara's progress at the end of each month," he said. "Specific. What she can do, what she is working toward, what methods you are using." Of course, Your Grace. And if there are books or materials you require, speak to Mrs. Peel. Cost is not a concern for the schoolroom. She noted this carefully. In her previous households, cost had always been a concern, presented with the apologetic firmness of people who wish to be considered generous while remaining otherwise. Thank you, she said. I would like a second chair near the fire. Clara sits too far from it and loses feeling in her fingers by mid-morning. Something shifted in his face. It was not an expression, exactly, more the slight alteration of stillness that precedes one. I will have it seen to today, he said, and turned back toward the window, dismissing her by implication. She was at the door before he spoke again, his voice lower and without inflection. She was not speaking at all 4 months ago. Michaela paused, her hand on the doorframe. She did not turn. Children who have stopped speaking have usually decided that speaking costs more than it returns, she said. One changes that calculation, one specific thing at a time. She left before he could respond, and she did not allow herself to think about the particular quality of the silence she walked out of. If you have found yourself drawn into Ashvalé's autumn alongside Michaela, stay with us. There is more to come, and the moment worth waiting for is still ahead. The second chair appeared before dinner. Mrs. Peel brought it herself, which Michaela suspected was not a coincidence. November arrived with rain and the first hard frosts, and with it came Lady Dorothea's renewed attention to the question of the Duke's future. Michaela was aware of this campaign the way a person is aware of weather forming over a distant ridge. Not immediately threatening, but accumulating, the air carrying a different pressure than before. She heard Miss Cecily Vane's name for the first time from one of the upstairs maids, then from Mrs. Peel in a careful aside, then from Lady Dorothea herself, who mentioned, during a chance crossing in the long gallery, that the Vane family were expected for a visit in the fortnight. Miss Vane is an accomplished young woman, Lady Dorothea said, pausing to straighten a small painting that did not need straightening. 3 seasons, considerable fortune, and the kind of deportment that settles a household. She did not look at Michaela while saying this. Of course, Ashvale requires a woman who understands her position. Yes, my lady, Michaela said. You are good with Clara, I am told. Lady Dorothea still did not look at her. That is the extent of what you are hired to be. She moved on down the gallery. Michaela stood a moment in the wake of those words, watching the older woman's gray silk recede, and felt the familiar, specific sensation of being measured against a standard she had not been consulted about. She carried it back to the schoolroom, where Clara was finishing a Latin translation, with the focused frown of a child beginning to enjoy difficulty. And she sat down and picked up her pen, and said nothing at all. The dinner at which Miss Vane was displayed took place on a Saturday in the 3rd week of November. Michaela was informed of her seating by Lady Dorothea's personal maid, who delivered the information with studied neutrality. Miss Hartley would dine in the servants' hall, as the table was being arranged for guests, and her presence was not required. Michaela thanked the maid pleasantly and went back to marking Clara's arithmetic. The wound was precise and familiar, and she had long since learned to hold it without expression. She did not see Miss Vane arrive. She heard the carriage, heard the voices in the entrance hall 2 floors below, and she recognized in the bright, confident tenor of one of them the particular music of a woman who had never been made to feel that she was too much for a room. She did not begrudge it. She simply noted it as one notes the weather. It was raining, and she was inside without a fire. And that was the arrangement. Miss Cecily Vane was everything Lady Dorothea had promised. Michaela saw her the following morning in the gallery, and the sight was genuinely arresting. Tall and graceful, her dark hair dressed with pearls, her gown the particular shade of apricot that flatters a perfect complexion. She moved through Ashvale as though she had already memorized its dimensions, which perhaps she had. She glanced at Michaela once, with the mild, incurious interest one directs at a well-placed piece of furniture, and continued on. 3 evenings later came the drawing room. A fire was lit. The company was assembled. Michaela had not been invited, and had not expected to be, and she was crossing the lower corridor on her way back from the library with a copy of Cowper she had borrowed for the schoolroom when she heard her name through the half-open door. Lady Dorothea's voice. Precisely calibrated. Miss Hartley is a perfectly adequate governess. One feels sorry for the girl's situation, naturally. A clergyman's daughter, reduced to hire. But one cannot expect her to understand the requirements of a house like Ashvale. She is provincial, in the deepest sense. There was a murmur. Cecily Vane's voice, light and pleasant. One must admire her for managing it all, I suppose. Michaela stood in the corridor for the length of 3 breaths. Then she walked on. The following morning, Clara showed her a drawing she had made unprompted. The kitchen garden as seen from the east wing window. Detailed and careful. The bare winter beds rendered in precise lines. At the bottom she had written, in her careful Latin hand, a small inscription from the natural history book. The starlings always know where they have been. Michaela looked at it for a long time. Then she told Clara it was the finest work she had produced, and asked if she might keep it. Clara, for the first time, smiled. It was small and brief and cautious, a smile that had not yet learned to trust its own longevity. But it was there, and it was real. And Michaela looked out the window at the frost on the kitchen garden, and allowed herself for a moment to feel something that was not grief. The library at Ashvale occupied the north wing's ground floor, and it had become Michaela's habit, on the evenings when she was not required for Clara's final lesson, to spend an hour there after the household had settled. The room was not warm, but the fire was kept going through the night by the footman, and she had found a chair near the east shelves where the lamplight fell well and the smell of old paper was strongest. And she considered it, privately, one of the small, honest pleasures of a life that had been arranged mostly around necessity. She was reading on the Thursday of the Vanes last evening, when she became aware that she was not alone. Julian stood in the doorway. He had removed his coat and wore only his waistcoat and shirt, the cravat loosened at the neck, which told her he had not expected to encounter anyone. He looked at her without speaking for a moment. She closed her book over one finger, marking the place. "I will leave, Your Grace, if you prefer the room." "No." He moved to the shelves on the west side, running his fingertips along the spines without appearing to read them. "I often come here in the evening." A pause. "I did not know you did as well." "I hope it was not improper. Mrs. Peel had not said it was restricted." "It is not restricted." He took a book down, examined its spine, returned it. He was standing with the firelight at his back and his face in partial shadow, and she noticed, because she had become a precise reader of things he did not say, that his shoulders carried a tension that had nothing to do with her presence. She was quiet. This was something she had learned in households. There are men who will speak if you do not fill the space ahead of them. After a moment he said, "Clara showed me her drawing today." Michaela waited. "She brought it to my study. She knocked on the door herself." He stopped. Something in his voice had shifted, going quieter in a way that was not quieter in volume. "She has not done that in a very long time. She is beginning to trust that the room will not change while she is in it," Michaela said carefully. He turned to look at her. The firelight reached his face, and she saw, for the first time, something beneath the studied insufficiency that she had been reading as coldness. It was not coldness. It was a man who had been standing at a specific distance from everything he loved because he had believed, in some unexamined place in himself, that closing the distance caused harm. She understood it because she had been watching it accumulate across 6 weeks of observed details, small deferred gestures toward Clara, a canceled lesson reinstated the moment the child asked, a second blanket appearing in the schoolroom without instruction attributed to him. She had read it as restraint protecting itself. She now understood it was restraint protecting others from what he feared he was. She did not say any of this. It was not hers to say. He was looking at the fire now, and he said so quietly she was not certain she was meant to hear it. Her mother asked me, at the end, not to make Clara small the way I had made her small. I did not understand what she meant. I thought I had given her everything. His jaw tightened. I gave her everything, except the one thing that cost something to give. The fire said nothing. Michaela said nothing. She thought of a portrait she had passed in the upper corridor, a woman with Clara's coloring and a gaze that had been painted as serene, but had something in it she had always read as tired patience. After a while he said, "You should not be cold," which was not what either of them were talking about, and she understood it as a command that was actually a retreat back to the practical, to the ground where he could manage himself. "I was just finishing," she said. "Good night, Your Grace." She was at the door before she let herself understand what she was feeling, and she spent the walk upstairs convincing herself that understanding and acting on understanding were two entirely different things, and that she was a woman hired at £40 a year to teach Latin and natural history, and that she had already been told, plainly and publicly, what she was for. She went to bed. She lay awake for some time. The dismissal came on the 1st of December, which was a Thursday, which Michaela would later find entirely unremarkable. Because the kind of cruelty that wears propriety as a costume tends to operate without irony. Lady Dorothea delivered it in the drawing room at 11 in the morning, with 3 of the Vane party still in the house, including Cecily herself, arranged beside the fire with her embroidery and the carefully composed expression of a woman absorbing someone else's difficulty with appropriate delicacy. A footman was present. Mrs. Peel had been summoned on some other pretext and stood near the door. "Miss Hartley," Lady Dorothea said, rising from her chair with the measured deliberateness of a woman exercising a right, "I have given considerable thought to Clara's requirements, and I have concluded that what she needs is a more settled arrangement than you are able to provide. A woman with deeper roots in a household of this rank. You have performed adequately, but adequately is not sufficient for Ashval." She held out a sealed letter. "This is 1 month's additional wage, as consideration. I believe you will find it generous." Michaela did not move immediately. She was aware of Cecily Vane's embroidery needle paused mid-stitch. She was aware of Mrs. Peel's stillness at the door. She was aware of the particular texture of being reduced in public, which is different from being reduced in private, because there are witnesses to confirm the reduction, to carry it forward into conversation, to make it a fact of record. She took the letter. She said, "Thank you, my lady," because she would not give the room the satisfaction of anything more, and she left. She did not go to her own room. She went to the schoolroom. Clara was at her desk, working through a passage from Homer. She looked up when Michaela entered. She read Michaela's face with the precision of a child who had spent 18 months reading adult faces for information that was never directly given. "Are you leaving?" she asked. Her voice was very even. Michaela sat down at the table. She said, "I am going to be honest with you, because I believe you are old enough to deserve honesty. Your grandmother has asked me to go. Clara put down her pen. I do not want you to go, she said. It was not a child's demand. It was a statement of fact, made with complete stillness. I know, Michaela said. And then, because there was nothing she could give the child that was more honest, I do not want to leave you. She went upstairs and sat at her writing table for a long time. Outside the window, the kitchen garden was under hard frost, the bare beds white, the horizon pale. 60 miles to London. What remained there was a rented room and the end of her father's debts and the beginning of finding another situation, another household, another child who needed someone to sit at the same table. She picked up her pen. She wrote not to Lady Dorothea, and not to the solicitor, and not to the nearest coaching inn. She wrote to Julian. She wrote 3 pages, and none of them were about herself. She described Clara's progress in terms so specific that any reader would understand they were not the work of a woman defending her position. They were the work of a woman who had been paying attention for 6 weeks to a child who had been paying attention for 18 months to the space adults made for her. She described the Latin, the drawings, the questions about starlings. She described the knock on the study door, and what it had cost Clara to lift her hand and make it. She described what she believed Clara needed from an adult she trusted, not warmth as performance, but consistency. The daily proof that the room would stay the same. She wrote, near the end, I ask nothing for myself. I ask only that you do not let her believe again that the people who see her will inevitably leave. She folded the letter. She addressed it. She gave it to Mrs. Peel, who took it without comment, with the same expression she had used in the entrance hall on the first morning. Not pity. Recognition. Then Michaela went back to her room and began to pack. She packed her books first, which was the reverse of how she had arrived. Homer went in last. She folded her brown traveling dress and laid it on top. She fastened her satchel at the worn clasp and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. It was a large house. It produced a particular quality of silence on cold mornings, thick and layered, the sound of many rooms and many years. She had spent 6 weeks inside it and had learned its acoustics the way she learned everything, by sustained quiet attention. And she sat now in the silence of it, and felt, for the first time, what leaving was going to cost. Not for herself. She had done this before. She had left her father's house, her childhood parish, 3 previous situations. She was a woman who had learned to inhabit places without putting down roots too deep to lift. But Clara had just learned to knock on a door. Michaela pressed her hand flat against the worn coverlet and stayed very still. Not because she did not know what she was feeling, but because she did. And because there was nothing to do with it except hold it and let it be true. This is the moment some of you have been waiting for. And if you have stayed this long, it is worth staying a little further. The winter gathering was not a formal ball. It was a smaller affair, a gathering of the county's families for supper and cards on the 15th of December. The kind of event Ashvale had hosted for 3 generations, and it served Lady Dorothea's purposes precisely because it was familiar. The county families knew the house, knew the Ashford name, knew the shape of what a proper arrangement for the Duke of Ashvale should look like. Cecily Vane had been extended a second invitation. She sat, the evening of the gathering, at Lady Dorothea's right hand. Michaela had not left. She had stood at the threshold of her packed room on the morning of the 2nd of December, her trunk ready, her satchel closed, and she had been unable to make herself go down the stairs. Not for herself. She had told herself, precisely and honestly, that it was not for herself. She had told herself it was because Clara had knocked on a door. Because the calculation of the cost of speaking had shifted for one specific child, and because Michaela knew, with the clarity of someone who had made this particular arithmetic before, that the shift was fragile and could be undone in a morning. She had unpacked Homer. She had gone back to the schoolroom. She had not spoken to Julian. She had received no response to her letter. She had continued teaching, continued sitting at the same table, continued reading aloud about starlings and the architecture of things that navigate by the Earth's own pull, and she had held herself to the discipline of a woman who was doing what was right, because it was right, and expecting nothing. The morning of the 15th, Mrs. Peel told her there would be a gathering that evening. She said it in the careful, sideways manner of a woman delivering information she has been instructed to deliver, neither more nor less than the fact. "Thank you, Mrs. Peel," Michaela said. "The Duke," Mrs. Peel said, and then stopped, as though reconsidering the territory. "He read your letter twice," she said finally. "I know because I brought it to him, and he was still holding it when I left the room, and I passed his study again an hour later, and the door was open." She left without saying anything more. The gathering assembled in the large drawing room at 7. Michaela was not among the invited. She knew this without needing to be told, had organized herself around it since the morning's conversation, and had spent the evening with Clara at her lessons, and then at supper in the schoolroom, the two of them eating at the small table with Clara reading aloud from Cowper, in a voice growing steadily more confident, her Latin pronunciation still approximate, but her rhythm increasingly exact. At 8:30, Clara's candle was lit and her door closed, and Michaela went back to the schoolroom to mark the next day's work. She sat at the table with her pen and Clara's Latin exercises and the faint sound of the gathering 2 floors below, string music and the polished noise of county society in a well-heated room. She was marking a particularly good translation of a line from the Odyssey when the door opened. Julian stood in the doorway. He was dressed for the gathering, his coat immaculate, his cravat precisely arranged, and he looked at her across the schoolroom with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the studied insufficiency, not the careful management. Something that had given up managing itself. "Miss Hartley," he said. "Your Grace." She set down her pen. "I received your letter." "Yes." "I have read it a considerable number of times." She waited. "I have also," he said, and she heard the cost of the sentence in the pause before he completed it. "Spoken with Mr. Finch this afternoon, about the matter of a settlement." The room was very quiet. Outside the schoolroom window, the grounds were dark, the frost catching what little light came from the lower floors, the bare oak at the north corner standing black against the gray sky. "I should tell you," Michaela said carefully, "that if this is for Clara's sake, there are other ways to ensure her situation." "It is not entirely for Clara's sake," he said. She looked at him. He was still in the doorway, which told her he was holding himself to the formal architecture of the space, giving her the room, not pressing forward. And she understood that this was what he did when he was trying to protect rather than manage. "Your Grace," she said. "Julian," he said, quietly, like a correction. She closed her eyes for just a moment. She opened them. "This is very sudden." "My mother dismissed you 3 weeks ago," he said. "I have been considering it rather longer than 3 weeks." "And the gathering," she said. "Your mother has arranged things with considerable confidence." "My mother arranges things with confidence because her confidence has always been rewarded," he said. "It will not be rewarded this evening." He offered her his hand. It was not a romantic gesture, not an embracing gesture. It was a door held open. She stood. She set down Clara's Latin exercises. She took his hand. The large drawing room had been arranged for a gathering of 32 people, which was the precise number required to make a public declaration feel like an event. Lady Dorothea was at the far end near the fire. Cecily Vane sat at her right hand. The county families were distributed across the chairs and settees in the conversational arrangements such evenings required, and the air carried the warm smell of beeswax candles and the punch that had been circulating since 7. The room became aware of Julian a moment before he spoke. The heads turned in the way that rooms turn toward authority when authority decides to use itself, and Michaela walked beside him across the full width of the gathering and felt every eye in the room move with them. Lady Dorothea rose from her chair. Her expression was controlled, but Michaela saw, at the far edge of it, the first thin fracture of a woman whose script has just been taken from her hand. Cecily Vane's needle stopped. She looked at Michaela for a moment with the clear-eyed recognition of a woman who has just understood that a contest she thought she was winning has already ended. Julian stopped in the center of the room. "I ask your attention for a brief matter," he said, which was entirely unnecessary because he had it entirely already. His voice was level, without theater. "Mr. Finch is present this evening at my request, and will record the following. I intend to marry Miss Michaela Hartley, and I have asked her to accept me, and she has done so." He paused. "I wish the county to hear it from me directly, so that there could be no question of the nature of the arrangement." The room's silence had a specific texture. Not shocked, exactly. The way a room goes quiet when it realizes it has been wrong about something for some time and must now recalibrate. Lady Dorothea stood with her fan at an angle that was no longer precisely the angle of assessment. She looked at Michaela, and in her expression Michaela read something she had not expected to find there. Not anger, but the beginning of recognition. As though the woman had arranged the furniture of her world's expectations according to a very careful plan, and the plan had produced this, and she was old enough and careful enough to begin, just to understand that it was not entirely without reason. She said nothing. After a long moment she sat down, and that sitting was the whole of it. Mr. Finch, a gray man of 50 with ink-stained fingers, and the professional stillness of a man who has witnessed many consequential evenings, made a small note in his ledger. He caught Michaela's eye once and gave the briefest nod of a man confirming that the record is clean. Julian's hand was still at her side. She was aware of it, the warmth of it, the specific solidity of a presence that had been standing at a careful distance for 6 weeks and had now closed it. She did not glow. She did not triumph. She stood in the center of the room and felt, under the assembled gaze of 32 people who had been wrong about her, the particular quiet dignity of a woman who has been given back something that was not taken by accident. Christmas came to Ashvale with the soft industry of a house that has remembered how to be warm. Mrs. Peel organized the kitchen with the focused pleasure of a woman who had been waiting for a reason to do so. Evergreen boughs appeared along the stair rail. A wreath of holly and dried rose hips was fixed to the door of the schoolroom, which was Clara's contribution, assembled with the same precise attention she brought to her Latin exercises. The kitchen garden, still frost-bound, showed the first faint promise of forced winter greens in the cold frames Michaela had asked to be installed in November, before she had known whether she would be there to see them used. She was there to see them. Julian had, in the days following the gathering, done something Michaela had not anticipated. He had begun, with the careful deliberateness of a man learning a new discipline, to leave doors open. The study door when he was working. The library door in the evenings. Not for her necessarily. For Clara. For the general principle that the house had rooms and the rooms were not closed. She understood what it cost him, and said nothing about it, which she knew was the only correct response. On Christmas morning, Clara asked to play the piano in the long gallery. She had not played since her mother died. The instrument had been kept in tune by the housekeeper's habit of maintenance, covered in its Holland cloth, and the Holland cloth had been there so long, Michaela had initially thought it was a piece of furniture. Clara asked with the careful tone she used when asking for things she was not certain would be permitted. And Julian, who had paused in the doorway of the gallery where he had been watching the snow begin outside the north window, said simply, "Yes." Clara sat at the keys for a long time without playing. Then she played, haltingly, a slow piece Michaela did not recognize, something her mother had played, she said after, something she had been trying to remember for a year. Julian stood in the doorway and listened, and Michaela stood beside him, and neither of them spoke. On the wall opposite the piano hung a portrait Michaela had passed for 6 weeks without looking at directly. The late Duchess, painted in the year of Clara's birth, her face arranged in the composure the painter had intended, and something else entirely looking out from behind it. Julian had taken the portrait from the wall of the study on the 2nd day of December, the day after the letter, and had it rehung here, in the gallery, turned to face the room. Michaela had not asked him about it. He had not explained it. It was simply a thing he had done, and she understood it as she understood the open doors. Not explanation, not ceremony, but the small costly action of a man beginning to allow himself to be a father again. The fire in the gallery hearth was the good deep fire of a house that intends to stay warm. The snow beyond the north window fell without urgency. The slow, deliberate fall of a season settling in, whitening the kitchen garden and the bare oak, and the ornamental pond now fully frozen at the east of the drive. Inside, the piano continued, Clara finding the phrase she had been chasing, playing it twice, then again, steadier each time. Michaela looked at the room, at the fire and the snow and the portrait and the child at the keys, at the man beside her who had crossed a full drawing room to give back what his own household had taken, and she felt in her chest the specific weight of a thing completed. She had arrived at Ashvale with 1 trunk, a worn satchel, and 40 pounds promised at year's end. She had arrived to be found unsuitable. She had been measured against standards she had not been consulted about, and found wanting in precisely the ways the hierarchy required its subordinates to be found wanting. She had held her hands folded and her expression composed, and she had sat at the same table as a child who had learned that speaking costs more than it returns, and she had changed that calculation, one specific thing at a time. It had been enough. It had always been enough. The world had simply required a witness. Clara played the phrase again, and this time she did not stop. She carried it forward, into the next bar and the next, her small hands moving with the steadiness of someone who has finally found the thing she was trying to say and discovered the body remembers it. The snow kept falling outside the north window, soft and unhurried, covering Ashvale in the patient white of a winter that did not know it had been waited for. Michaela was home. If Michaela's story moved something in you today, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. Quiet stories told with care are what this corner of the world is built for, and your company makes them worth telling.